some bird song somewhere. Is that?
Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. How you all doing today? And today I am very excited to have an author of many, many books in the paranormal. He's from the UK. His name is Mr. Paul Adams. And he he has so many interesting books. I can't wait to get into that with him. But anyway, and this is a very good description. He's an established author. He hasn't written one book or two books. He's written several books. And the titles of some of them are Haunted St. Albans, The Haunted Counties, and The Enigma of Rosalie. And as a matter of fact, right before we started rolling, I was asking him about it because the case of Rosalie is a spirit child, and Harry Price, which was a paranormal investigator from the 1930s and around that time period, 1920s. This was one of his most controversial investigations, and it's remained a mystery for 80 years. He also has other current writing projects, which include a study of horror and the supernatural in Western music, which I got to talk to Paul about that, called Music Macabre, a biography of the late Peter Underwood, and a horror fiction novel titled The Architecture of Evil. So it is fantastic to have you here today, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me on the program. It's nice to be here.
No, thank you. My pleasure. I'm going to ask you, Paul, what I ask most of my guests, which is, obviously you've written books, but how did you get involved in the paranormal? Did you have a childhood experience? Was it something that happened as an adult?
Well, most people do have this. They have a sort of an experience which they can't explain, and that sort of gets them on the sort of road to investigating the paranormal. With me, I mean, it sounds very corny. It wasn't like that. It was literally through reading ghost stories as a child. You know, there was a great series in England, the Armada Book of Ghosts, edited by a lady called Mary Danby, and they were just the sort of little spooky stories that sort of got my imagination going. So I read sort of fiction, and then later on, about 1977, I came across a couple of books by non-fiction titles by Dan Farson, and they were about real life cases like Borley Rectory and places like that. And then I went on holiday with my parents down to a place called Sanford Orcus, which is a very small village in Sherborne in Dorset in the southwest of England. And there's a manor house there, which had, at that time, it had the reputation of being the most haunted house in England. And we were shown round by the tenant, who was a chap called Colonel Claridge. And he and his wife claimed that they had all sorts of paranormal experiences, seen apparitions and heard all sorts of things, going back to when they moved in. I think they moved in there in about the mid-1960s. So I went down to this place, and it was literally like something out of a Hammer horror film set. It literally had like suits of armour and all this sort of stuff. And I walked around with my parents, and Claridge was there, and he said, "Oh, well, we see this person, this figure here and this figure there," and that really got me interested in it. And that really got me interested in real life, you know, hauntings and things like that. That the ghost stories that I read as a child, there were actually real things going on. So and it sort of went from there, you know.
Right, exactly. And the reason why I ask you this is because sometimes I've run into people, especially as children, where that experience does one of two things. It interests them more in the paranormal, or they do the exact opposite. They run away from it, and they want nothing. They have such a bad scare that they want to have nothing whatsoever to do with the paranormal. And I mean, I kind of did the same thing when I was growing up. You know, back then it was as far as nonfiction was Hans Holzer, and he had a series of books. You know, that he would go to all these different houses, and he would bring over mediums like Sybil Leek. And usually
Trixie Allingham, wasn't it? Trixie Allingham was another one you worked with.
He had like different mediums that he would bring over, and was his way of communicating with the spirits. Because back then, you know, there's not the host of equipments or anything. He would use these mediums to basically talk to the ghost and find out who it is. And then, of course, you know, through the years, it became a little bit more mainstream, and then you saw more people getting into it. As far as the nonfiction, because there's always been ghost stories, as a matter of fact, the fictional type have always been popular for many, many, many years. And I myself, I have huge books of Victorian ghost stories around, those eight, because they're so
Wrote the
fantastic.
best ghost story. The Victorians wrote the best ghost
Oh
stories.
yes, yes, and of course everybody's name was an initial, Mrs. S, Mr.
That's it.
R. Nobody had a full name because even back then, discretion was very important.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, I have had a couple. I mean, I have had a couple of odd experiences in later life. Around about 1992, I bought my first house, which was a really old cottage in Mickleham in Surrey, which is about 20 miles south of London. And there, before I moved in, there was an elderly lady who'd lived there all her life, and she had moved out because she couldn't live on her own anymore. And when she lived there, the house had no electricity, so it was all candles and oil lamps and things like that. And I moved in, and I was there about a week. And by that time, it had been updated, and there was power and things. And one evening, I went down into the cellar. It had a basement area, which was actually the largest room in the house. And I went down the stairs, and I came through this. It was like walking through a smell of candle grease, as if somebody had just had candles lit, and it was this smell of candle wax. And I hadn't had anything like that on at all. And it struck me as really strange. And it was just at this one spot on the stairs. And it was there, and then it sort of went. And I mentioned it to the neighbour next door, and she said, "Oh, that sounds like Mary Saunders," because she used to have like candles and things, And I never ever smelt it again.
Wow.
And the last day, I lived there 6 years, and in that time I got married, and we had our first child, and we were expecting another child, and we had to move because the house was too small. And the last day that I was there, all the furniture had been moved out and everything, and I was there just locking up, and I walked down, and exactly the same spot, I smelt it again, this smell of candle grease,
Isn't that unusual?
It was almost like hello and goodbye.
Right, exactly. That's what I was about to comment. As soon as you get there and when you're ready, and I always I was going to say, well, maybe it's a residual, but then you think of that timing, and it makes you think there's a little bit of intelligence behind it.
Yeah.
Because it was when you moved in and when you were leaving. It wasn't like you could say, well, you know what, every time I would go down those stairs at a certain time, or, I came across that smell, and I would say, well, maybe it's a residual thing. But yeah, it makes you think there was like a goodbye. Yeah. Hello, goodbye.
Thing. And another thing that was this was quite recent. This was about 3 years ago. We went to a place called Mount Fitchett Castle near Stansted Airport, which again is about 25 miles sort of northeast of London. And that's a Norman castle, dating back to like the 11th century. And they rebuilt they sort of tried to recreate parts of the old buildings with these modern things. They were built in an old style, And in one of those buildings, I was with 3 of my children, and we all felt really weird at one point where you went through a doorway from one big room into another room. And I felt really, and I don't normally pick up on things like this at all, And I felt like I was on a ship, as if I felt really unsteady, And one of my other children felt really sick. Another one felt she was being pushed in the back. And it was really odd. And it was just at this one spot when you went through this door. And there were other people there. And I asked them, I said, "Do you feel anything weird at this spot?" And they looked at me as if I was like mad, And so when we left, I mentioned it to the people the people who worked there. And they said, "Oh, yeah." And they went and got this photograph, and they had one of these paranormal groups had been there about 18 months before, and they'd set up a camera and taken a photograph of this really odd, what looked like a figure, and it was in exactly the spot where we went through the doorway. So that was quite interesting.
Isn't that, and that's the thing where once somebody introduces a connection, because you have nothing whatsoever to do with a group that was there 18 months before. What are the chances that in that same exact spot, there's going to be some type of anomaly, whether it was photographed or in this case that you felt it? It's like, okay.
Yeah, it was all of us, all 4 of us.
Right, and all of you felt it.
All felt really odd at this point. And then, and then we walked through and it was gone. So it was really, really odd, They're the sort of odd things that have happened to me, So it's...
and one time I was up... I'd gone to a meeting up in Vermont, in the mountains of Vermont, and we were staying at this old, like, a house that they had converted into like a kind of like a small inn. It was out in the middle of nowhere. And we were all, they had made like a big bonfire out in the back of the property, and we were all sitting there talking. And finally, I couldn't take it. And I turned around to one of the ladies that I knew, and I said, I don't know why, but I keep feeling somebody staring at us or at me, I want to say, from the top window, like on the second floor of the inn. And I can't get. And around that time, one of the owners comes down and he goes, oh, yeah, that's the guy, the farmer, the spirit of the farmer that used to live out here. And he came in, he pulled out this book of people throughout the years, which had talked about exactly what I felt. It was like, really?
Yeah.
Where that had some time, and at that second story window that looked out towards the back of the property. And I was like, wow, okay. Because I was like, oh, okay, maybe I got jet lag or something. But I know what you mean when it comes off that it's like, okay, it's not my imagination. It's not me being paranoid. And like you said, you had all of your same family members have the same experience.
Yeah, collective experience, which makes it more evidential, doesn't it?
I think that is so interesting. And let me, as far as this book, and I had mentioned to you, the Enigma of Rosalie.
Yes.
What is that about? This apparently he was involved with it back in the 1930s.
That's right. Yeah, Harry Price was the sort of in the 20s and 30s. He was probably the sort of the go-to man for certainly with the general public, was the sort of main man for to do with paranormal phenomena. He was well known with the newspapers, and if ever there was a case haunting or anything like that, the newspapers would always go to Harry Price. He was very good with publicity and promoting himself. He was a sort of a controversial figure, but he was very passionate about the subject. And this is a time when the sort of paranormal scene was very different from how it is today. In those years, up until I'd say probably just after the end of the Second World War, everybody was investigating spiritualism, seances and things like that. That was where organised psychical research was mainly involved. I mean, it sort of changed after the Second World War, sort of divided. I mean, the mediumship sort of fell off.
Right.
People started doing more statistical stuff. Ryan over at Duke University, over on your side of the water, and then so you had the statistical stuff and the and more the spontaneous things. Like the more sort of ghost hunting that we would look at it now. But in the 30s and the 20s, people were interested in seances and trying to, investigate mediums, especially physical mediums, who said they could materialise spirits and things like this. And this is where the sort of Rosalie case comes from. It dates from 1937, although Harry Price didn't really make it public until about 18 months later. And he was he had revived a ghost club, which is an old paranormal society, probably the oldest paranormal society in England. It dates from about the 1850s, but it's had various incarnations over the years. Price revived it in the 30s as a sort of a dining club where you went and had a nice meal in an expensive restaurant in London, and you had lectures on ghosts and things like this. And there he said that he had, about 18 months before, the end of December 1937, he'd been contacted by a lady who said that she'd heard him on a radio broadcast the previous month, which was incidentally about Borley Rectory, but it wasn't actually named. Because he was still investigating it then, and it was still a private investigation. But in the broadcast, he'd said a phrase. He said, "At this house, I can guarantee you a ghost." And the lady, when she phoned Price up, said, I can guarantee you a ghost, but it's one much more tangible nature. We hold a seance meeting every week at my home where the figure of a 6-year-old girl that he called Rosalie always materialised. Okay. And she was inviting Harry Price to come for a one-off experience to meet and to experience the alleged materialisation of Rosalie. So this is what he said had taken place. and this was on the 15th of December 1937.
Okay.
And subsequently, when he published details of the case, he described what had happened to him, but he never, because he said it was an agreement with the family that they didn't want any publicity. He never ever said who the people were or where he went and where the house was. He was somewhere in London. And so it always remained a sort of a mystery, because he describes in his book, a book called 50 Years of Psychical Research, which came out in 1939, he describes going to the house on a Wednesday evening in December and meeting the family, meeting the mother of Rosalie, who was a French lady who had married an Englishman who had been killed in the First World War. They'd had a child called Rosalie who had died in 1921 of diphtheria, and she was a friend of the family. He calls them Mr. and Mrs. X. Mr. and Mrs. X, and there was a daughter, Miss X, teenage daughter, and he calls the mother of Rosalie Madame Z, so she's always been known as Madame Z. But he met the family, and then they retired to a room in the house where Price was able to, and this is the important thing with the Rosalie case, is that Price, who was I'd say he was probably one of the most experienced investigators of seance phenomena in England at that time, and he knew tricks of how if he was being fooled. So he was able to search the sitters. He was able to search the room. This is what he says. And he sealed the door. He sealed the windows, and he arranged the sitters in a circle in the room. There was actually a dog in the room. Actually, there was a dog which was in the room as well, but that wasn't disturbed. It was sitting by the fire. And he said that during the course of the séance, which was in blackout conditions, which lasted about 2 hours, for about 20 minutes of that, towards the end, he experienced the materialisation of Rosalie. In the darkness, he felt something next to him. He was able to reach out and touch what he describes as a naked figure in the darkness, was able to feel its heartbeat, and with a luminous plaque, piece of cardboard with a luminous paint on it, which had been placed down on the floor, he was able to examine the figure, and he described seeing a figure of a child, which was a blonde child, completely nude, and he was allowed to speak to it. And the child didn't. He asked several questions in quite an emotional atmosphere. The ladies in the room were very. Madame Z was very emotional at seeing her child again, and Price even himself says that he was affected emotionally by this experience. Rosalie never spoke, only to on an impromptu when Price asked her did she love her mother. She just said yes. And then the séance was brought to an end. The lights were extinguished, and about 15 minutes later, the room lights were put up, and Rosalie had gone completely. And Price was allowed to search the room. He searched the sitters. All his seals were unbroken, and it left him with this incredible experience. And for someone who was very skeptical of, he did, when he did encounter genuine phenomena, he did champion it, but he was very skeptical towards spiritualism. I mean, he described spiritualism as I think something like the embarrassment of the thinking man. He was very blasé towards it, but this experience really shook him, and the next day he was at his office in London. He was a sort of a part-time researcher. He worked. He had a full-time job, a job in a paper company. Okay. And he was able to juggle this quite well with psychical research, and he had his own office in London. And several people who saw him that day, on the day after the séance, realised that he was very, very upset by this. It had really sort of shaken him, Okay. So he wrote this account, and it was published in 1939. And up until sort of my book coming out last year, it has sort of remained very much a mystery, because
Right.
Price never ever he never had another sitting. He claimed that he tried to have other sittings with them, but Madame Z was always frightened that Rosalie might be scared away and that she would not see her again. And then the war came, and apparently, so Price said, much later, he wrote a short article in a magazine in 1946 where he says that what happened was he kept in touch with the family. They were sort of promising maybe that there might be another sitting, that he could bring colleagues and hopefully maybe even do it in his own laboratory. But then the war came. Madame Z went to France, was caught up in the invasion of France, and was sort of nothing was ever heard of her again. So
Right.
it was a sort of an unsatisfactory ending to it.
Right.
And then after Price died in 1948, and after his death, some cases were looked on again and they were sort of attacked. Certainly the Borley Rectory, which was his most famous
Right,
investigation.
and which is what I said with him. I had never heard of this case. The one you always hear about is Borley Rectory.
Borley Rectory is the most famous one, but
Exactly.
After he died, it was reinvestigated by members of the Society for Psychical Research, and they felt that Price had. Their report, which was published in 1956, was very, very critical about Price, and his posthumous reputation at that time really nosedived, And then a couple of years later, the same people looked at Rosalie and also felt that basically that he had made the whole thing up, that he had used it. It was made up. It was a made-up story in order to sell this book, in order to give a sensational chapter that the newspapers would latch on in reviews, and that there was no substance to it. So for a long time, Rosalie case was sort of just really it was just rubbished. And then in the 1960s, there was a sort of resurgence of interest in it. A man called David Cohen from Manchester in England became very interested. And lots of things sort of happened in the 60s, so sort of to do with Rosalie. Cohen became very interested in it, and he was upset at the way that Price's reputation had been sort of attacked in the 60s. There was a sort of a period in the 60s of almost fashionable denigration of some of the earlier figures in psychic research. Critical books were published about not only Harry Price, but Frederick Myers, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. Edmund Gurney was another founder of the SPR, and that there was some critical accounts published about him. So Cohen got very upset about this, so he decided to champion Price and see if he could reinvestigate Rosalie. And he tried to do this, and he didn't really succeed. But what he did do was he self-published a book called Price and His Spirit Child Rosalie, which came out in 1965, and in it he offered a reward of £25, which was in those days was quite a large amount of money, for any information that anybody might have that might lead to the identifying of the house or the people involved. So it sort of that happened. Then Cohen unfortunately was very ill, and he passed away the following year. Around about the same sort of time that Cohen was involved, other people were two people from the Society for Psychical Research, Mary Rose Barrington and Richard Medhurst. They became interested in it, and they found in Harry Price's papers, which were bequeathed to the University of London, they found a carbon copy of a letter which showed that Price had actually gone to a séance when he said it was a letter written to Madame Z, written to Mrs. X, accepting the invitation. And although so there was an actual physical piece of evidence. Letter, there was no address on the letter, but there was a name. There was a name called Mrs. Mortimer. And so that sort of gave them a bit of a clue. So what the people did was, Harry Price, in his account, he had described the house very accurately from the outside. He said, I want my readers to imagine what it was like, because Harry Price was very good at, self-promotion. He was the top man, and he liked his readers to know that he was in control and noticing everything. So he really described the house, beg pardon, in great detail. There were 12 stone steps up to the front door.
Oh my, that much detail, huh? Okay.
Yeah. And, double-fronted house with so many windows on the front elevation and this sort of thing. So what the people did in the 60s, Barrington and Medhurst, they copied out all of the Mortimers that were in the public phone book.
Okay.
In 1937, and then they went round and found all the some of the houses were gone because they'd been bombed and that sort of thing during the war. But they went round and they tried to find a house which matched the description of the house that Harry Price had given. Okay. But they were unsuccessful. They couldn't find one. The only one which seemed similar was a house in a suburb of South London, suburb of Brockley. And it was a double-fronted house. There was a Mortimer family living there. But there were differences, and they had to discount it. And funnily enough, it's one of these sort of it seemed to be a strange coincidence that Harry Price knew Brockley very well because he used to live there when he was a young man. So it seemed rather too much of a coincidence that Brockley, that was that place. So again, the investigation sort of stalled. There'd been a little bit of an advance. It looked like there was a name, but there was nobody. They couldn't find it. And then a strange thing happened in April 1966, about 6 months before David Cohen passed away. He received an anonymous letter postmarked from London. It was anonymous, but the writer signed herself Rosalie. It was handwritten, and the writer claimed that she was actually the daughter of Miss X. She was actually the daughter of the family, and had been at the séance in 1936. And she confessed that the séance had been a fake.
Oh.
And, she confessed that it was a fake, and the reason why it was a fake was that her parents, her father, who worked on the stock exchange in London, had messed up, and he'd lost a lot of money, and in order to sort of bail himself out, he knew that a friend of his, this was Madame Z, was quite a wealthy woman. He made a pretense of investing money for her in some sort of non-existent business deal. He'd basically taken her money and sort of paid off his debts, but now he was left with owing Madame Z. So in order to buy himself some time, he knew that she was very attached to the memory of her daughter who had passed away.
Oh,
so
I see.
They decided to fake these seances and fake Rosalie to keep Madame Z sweet and happy while he earned enough money to pay her off. So it was a scam. This is what the anonymous letter...
wow. So the actual lady with the dead daughter did exist. It was... Oh.
Well, so this letter came in. David Cohen was convinced it was real. He thought, well, okay, I was hoping that there was some sort of genuine phenomena there, but he felt it was a genuine letter. But a lot of other people at the time felt that the actual Rosalie letter, as I call it, was itself a hoax. Felt that somebody was pulling David Cohen's leg, and that they'd gone through Price's account, they'd written this letter, and that it itself was a joke. You see, so. It was sort of, again, there was an advance, but there wasn't an advance,
Yes.
So that was really how the Rosalie case was left. In the mid 70s, there was a little bit more interest in it. People tried to see if they could do anything with it. They had some mediums came and tried to psychometrize the letters, the Mortimer letter and the Rosalie letter, to see if they could get any information, but nothing really happened. And the case has sort of been in history until and since those times,
Right.
and I became very interested. I was interested in Borley Rectory from a long time ago, and I'd done a book on Borley Rectory, which came out in 2009. And so after that, I decided I thought I was have a go at Rosalie, and I wanted to try and just do a history of the case, and just because all these events that I've been talking about, they have been published in different books and different magazines over a long period. So I thought, okay, I'll do a history and I'll bring all of it together and just publish this, write this book. And there was a sort of maybe a little hope in the back of my mind that I might be able to make some sort of inroad into it, but it was such a long time ago, and and all of the people involved would be
I was going to say, they've all passed away, right?
All passed away. So I started doing it, and I started writing up the case, and I went to, we are very, very fortunate over here that Harry Price left all of his papers and his books and his letters and correspondence in a vast archive, which is held library, and it is one of the most important collections of historical psychical research papers here in the UK. Not only people like me go and look through its stuff, but it's it's a sort of a real history for that period. So it's a very important collection. So I went up there and started looking through the Price's letters and did some work on it, and I got to a point. I was managed to sort of write a sort of a history of it, but as I reached a barrier. I couldn't go any further because I didn't. There were little indicators amongst some of the letters that gave sort of more clues that maybe broccoli, where it may have been there, but there was nothing definite. There was nothing definite there at all. And this was some time ago. This was back about 2010 when I was doing this, and so I sort of put the case on the back burner, and I wrote other books, but always it was always in the back of my mind that Rosalie might be, So about a couple of years ago, I decided that okay, I'm going to finish this book. I'm going to finish the history of it, and unfortunately, it's going to be left as open. But in that time, a lot of online records have become available. Like there's some websites over here, Find My Past and Ancestry, where there are a lot, genealogical data and things on there, which makes it a lot easier for people to research things. And one of these websites had put on some details of there was a census which was taken in 1939 in this country. Which was on the outbreak of war in September 1939. They did a snapshot census to issue people with identity cards at the beginning of the war, and it's not a finite collection because people who are still alive aren't in it, and the records, if anybody people who have died within the past 25 years, their records are closed, but it's still a good it's a good snapshot. Source. So what I did was I started to go through. I made a list of all the Mortimers in London that were in the 1939 census, and there were nearly 500 people. So I got all the people, and I went through all of their addresses, and I made a big list. It took months.
I can imagine.
A list of all these people, and then I started looking at. Really, I was very sort of unhappy with the description that Price had given of this house. It seemed too contrived. It seemed made up to me. And it was sort of proved because I'd found some letters in his archive where he said that the report that he published in his book was verbatim and uncorrected. He'd begun it on the night of the séance in bed at his London club, and he'd finished it the following day, and it had not been edited. But I found that it had been edited.
Okay.
He had changed some details, like the 12 stone steps that I mentioned going up to the front door. In that, he seems to have added that in because in the original version, it just says a flight of stone steps.
Do you think he did that to mislead in case anybody
I think so.
Okay.
Yes, I think he changed things because he didn't want he felt it was too exact.
Right.
So,
Okay.
but I thought to myself, well, maybe some aspects of this house are. Some of it's right and some of it's wrong, because he described the house as being on a corner of a main road and a side road, with what we call an area at the front. In London, London houses often have a basement story, which you can see the front windows you can see from the pavement, and so he describes it. So I went through and I looked at every where possible. I looked at every single house, and obviously I had the advantage that I could go on Google Street View and look at the houses, so I didn't have to actually physically go there like the other people did in the 1960s. And I went there and I looked at these houses, and I was making a list of all the people who lived, all these Mortimers, and I was more interested in the type of household, because the price describes it as them being quite affluent people. They had live-in servants. There was a cook there. There was a maid who answered the door. So they were quite a specific type of people. And doing this, it was possible to eliminate the household that had been examined in the 60s, the house in Brockley that the other investigators had thought. I found that house was a house in multiple occupation. There were several families living in this one house. So that really ruled that out. And working my way through this list of people, I eventually came and I found a family that seemed to sort of fit the bill. And that was a house in Cadogan Square in Kensington in London. There was a Mortimer family living there. And they seemed to sort of stand out as the family fitted this. This guy worked in the city, as did Mr. X in the story. And so they were my front runners, and they seemed to be, it seemed that they might be the people. But I was able to, we mentioned that Peter Underwood, who was a friend of mine and who was one of our great, sadly Peter passed away in 2014, but he was one of our big writers on the paranormal in the 70s and 80s, and he bequeathed to me a lot of his papers and letters before he died. He gave them to me, and he had in there was a photograph of one page of the anonymous letter that was written to David Cohen. The original has been lost, unfortunately, but there's a photograph of one page, handwritten. So what I did was I got hold of the will of the daughter of the house, of the Mortimers that I'd found in Kensington, and had a graphologist do a handwriting analysis writing on the will with the writing on the page of the Rosalie letter, and they matched. So,
wow, what a detective you are!
So it was quite a moment where, to think that there was, that Harry Price had been sort of vindicated because he did go to this place, and now we had an actual place. And the story is quite complicated. These were the people involved, and now that the Rosalie letter had been proved to be real, you could see that the reasons were genuine, that it was actually a case of fraud, that the people. But it was interesting to do, and
absolutely, because it's always, of course, he was attacked posthumously. He couldn't defend himself, and of course, it's very easy to attack somebody's credibility when they're not there to challenge you. Or
that's right.
And you, I believe in the summary of the work, it was like, did he know this was a fraud, or or did he allow himself to be?
I think initially he believed that he might have experienced genuine phenomena. Because what happened in the Rosalie letter, this is the strange thing about the Rosalie letter. The lady who wrote the anonymous letter, who I now know was a lady called Joan Mortimer, she claimed that she had fooled Harry Price by, in the dark phase of the séance, she'd taken all her clothes off and pretended to be the ghost of Rosalie by standing in the nude.
Okay.
and then redressed herself in the in the other part of the dark phase. So that was how she said that she had cheated Harry Price. But I found that there was a problem with that, because she wasn't. Price described her as being about 15 years, about 17
Right.
years.
That's
She
quite a
was
difference in age.
Well, she was actually 30 at the time, so there's no way.
Oh,
There
wow.
was no way that she could have done it. So
Okay.
what I feel that she did, she wasn't telling the exact truth. I believe that they had someone hidden in the room, and
Okay.
a good thing that I was able to do was the house and it still stands. This house in Cadogan Square in Kensington, very, very expensive property. It's been changed a lot inside. It's been completely remodeled inside, but outside it looks exactly the same. There were drawings that were up on the internet from the planning authority when the house was converted, when the house was refurbished.
Okay.
And I managed to get the drawings of the rooms, the plans of the room. And this is another thing where Price gives a rough size of the room in his account of the room, and if you take his dimensions and overlay them on the actual plan of the house, it fits like a glove. So the actual room, that's another thing. But
Right.
I noticed that in the corner of one room there was a little cupboard that was in the corner of one room.
Oh.
And I think that possibly, even though Price just happened to have missed it. I think maybe the room was panelled, but I think they had somebody in that. I think they had somebody in that cupboard
Okay.
who played Rosalie. Now I don't think that they had a real child come out and do it. I think that was probably too risky. Now this is conjecture on my part, but it is sort of backed up with evidence. The people who lived at the house, the Mortimers who lived at the house, they had a son called Roger Mortimer, who wasn't involved. He was in the army when the seances were taking place. He was in North Africa. But he later went on to become the racing correspondent for the Sunday Times newspaper over here. And recently, within the past 5 or 6 years, his children have published collections of their letters from him to them, and in it he mentions his father. He mentions the Mortimers, and in one of them he describes the sort of servants they had, and he describes them having a dwarf maid who was, I mean, they called her Minnie, but I mean it wasn't a real name, but they said they had a dwarf servant, a maid, and so I thought, well, it's conceivable that they could have got her to play the ghost of Rosalie, and in the dark, in the heightened atmosphere of the seance room,
Of course.
they could have.
That is wow.
That's the only thing that's slightly.
You could think, okay, who did they use for?
Who did they use for it? But I mean, that is a possibility, And in those days, servants were treated a lot different. They were servants, weren't they? And it was like, you do this sort of thing, or you're out on your ears.
Exactly.
So that was one of the things. And another coincidence of the case is that when Harry Price's book, The 50 Years of Psychical Research, when that was published in 1939, it was reviewed by a magazine called John O' London's Weekly. And in it, the reviewer, Clifford Bax, for some reason, remember, I found the house was in Kensington. He actually describes the review. He calls it the Kensington Ghost Girl. And I thought, how on earth did he know that? Did he know it? Is it a coincidence? There is a possible. I think that it's one of those odd coincidences, because Harry Price, funnily enough, had two of his laboratories where he had his offices where he did his seance investigation stuff were actually in Kensington.
Okay.
So I think that Bax in his review had got slightly mixed up and knew that Price was from Kensington, thought that maybe the seance had taken place in Kensington at his laboratory. So it was one of these odd...
Right, it was just coincidental because of where his laboratories were at.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that was an interesting thing. So what I think happened, I think that the sort of the tale of the tape is that when Cohen's book came out in 1965, offering the reward for information, he actually put a little bit at the bottom of one of the pages and said, mentioning this review by Clifford Bax, the Kensington Ghost Girl, and says in a little footnote, it wouldn't surprise me to know that to find out that the séance was in Kensington. So I think when the lady, the real Joan Mortimer,
exactly,
somehow she came across this book and thought, my goodness me, they're on to me.
She's like, what?
And at that time, her mother was still alive. Her father had passed away, but her mother was still alive. So I think, again, to protect the family honour sort of thing, she wrote trying to sort of push them away by saying, look, it was a fake, I did it, but I'm not going to tell you anymore. And she introduced some red herrings, if you like the idea of her taking her clothes off in the séance and that sort of thing.
Right.
So it was a sort of a strange mystery. The only thing that I haven't been able to find out is the identity of Rosalie herself and her mother.
Okay.
Madame Z and Rosalie. For some time, I had a real strong front runner, a lady by the name of Jane O'Malley Keyes, who was known to the family, and she seemed to sort of tick a lot of the boxes in that she was associated with France, and there was a connection with the family. But unfortunately, although she had 5 children, none of them died in childhood. So so unless she had a child that did die and it was covered up, or it was it was just never recorded. So so that's the only thing that is still outstanding, and maybe one day I might be able to make another inroad into it, or somebody else might come along and there might be some information, but at the end of the day, the case has been sort of
that is such an interesting case, because and I see now what you meant, that it spans 80 years in the sense of even back then. And then, but I could see what you said, that the daughter at some point probably was thinking, oh, the next thing I know, I'm going to have somebody knocking on my door.
She's going to have ghost hunters knocking on her door.
And she says, like you said, if I make it, the ghost interest will disappear and they'll forget about it.
That's right. I mean, these people were very well connected. I mean, they had friends who were friends with royalty, and they all moved in all these sort of big high circles. I mean,
they would have been very embarrassed if that would.
Yeah, so that's why they did it. So obviously, but now the sort of cat's out of the bag, so to speak. But
or like you said, let's say they did use a servant. Okay, maybe also she was thinking the last thing I need is for this person, if they were still alive, maybe.
Yeah.
To, for somebody to investigate it further. I could see where she said, I have to stop this quick.
Yeah. Because the book came out in about the middle of 1965, and the letter was written about 6 months later. So she'd obviously come across a copy of it. How she did is a bit of a mystery, because the book was actually self-published. It wasn't published by a major publisher. It was published by Regency Press, who were what they used to call a vanity publisher over here. And because reviewers knew that it was that sort of book, it didn't tend to get reviewed very well. So the book was quite an obscure title. So, but somehow she managed to see a copy of it, and the story, and it went from there. But
you stop and you think about it. If you ever, as an adult, you realize your parents did something like that, those circumstances that they're like, oh my God. and think about it, even though you don't live your life, you always have that hanging over your head.
Yeah.
What if this ever explodes?
Yeah, the skeletons in the cut, isn't it?
It'll make us look like, forget it. Then I'll so yeah, I could, but that is so interesting. And like you said, back in those times, it wasn't just a question of the medium, let's say the spirit taking over the vocal cords. It was where they would actually materialize.
That's right.
Ectoplasm, or in this case, when you said that he touched the body, I'd be like, oh my God.
Yeah,
I think if some ghost hunters nowadays actually touch the body, they'd like run screaming from the building.
But yeah, this was the whole thing of the the materialization. I mean, Price had met one. There were two mediums that he did experiment with, did investigate in the 20s and in the 30s. One was a lady called Stella Cranshaw, who was an English nurse who Price felt did produce genuine phenomena. She could move objects
Okay.
and that sort of thing. And there was another medium called Rudy Schneider, the Schneider brothers, Willie and Rudy. Willie was a physical medium. Rudy was a more powerful medium. He came to London in the early 1930s. Price had sittings with him, and he was convinced that Rudy had produced genuine phenomena, that objects had moved in the seance room, and that they had seen partial materializations of arms and faces, coming out of the seance cabinet. So Price was convinced that materialization phenomena was possible. It was just, and I think that's why he was so initially by the appearance of Rosalie. A seance, a seance that took place under his own control, under his own conditions of control.
Right. But like you said, sometimes, and we'll never know. He's probably the only one that does know. But sometimes when you have investigators of all types, they're well recognized. Sometimes they do overlook the obvious, despite their experience. Like you said, there might have been that cabinet or cupboard in the corner or hidden somehow that he just didn't see it for whatever reason, or they put it in such a way. And
I think what went in their favour was that I think Price, he actually was quite. He initially wasn't going to go. It was only that a colleague of his, a man called Richard Lambert, who was the editor of the Listener magazine, happened to have lunch with Harry Price the day that he received the phone call. Price sort of mentioned it to him, and he said, it's not going to bother. It's just going to be it's going to be another fraud. And Lambert said, no, you've got to go along. You've got to go. So he persuaded him to go. And I think that Price, when he turned up there, he was expected some sort of typical spiritualist seance, a back parlour type thing, singing hymns and that sort of thing. It wasn't. When he went there, he suddenly arrived at this big, affluent London townhouse. And I haven't been inside, but I've been outside. I've been around outside. And I think they had him at a disadvantage. You thought, what's going on here? These people aren't the usual spiritualist types. These look like really, serious people, Not that I'm saying spiritualists aren't serious people.
And I understand exactly what you mean. When he got there, he had this preconceived idea, maybe based on his prior experience. So when he gets there, like you said, he's going to, like you said, they have servants, higher social status. So he's thinking, absolutely, these people would not risk doing a fraud because it would make them look so bad. So exactly. I could see.
So I think he was at a disadvantage, and although he said he checked the room thoroughly, it's conceivable that, well, I believe he did overlook. He did overlook this one area, and it just happened to be. They were very. They were very lucky that he didn't find it. I don't know I don't know how familiar they were. The reason that the Price was brought in, so the anonymous letter says, was the fact that Rosalie's mother had actually become suspicious herself.
Oh my God, that's
she was a little bit unsure things were going on, you see.
Because you know what? I was thinking, well, if they did this for this lady to buy time, I think why would they want to bring in somebody that was known for busting mediums? That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, so they brought Price in. She asked, I want somebody to come in to check on this. And obviously, Harry Price was the famous person.
Of course.
She'd known about him, so I said, I want Harry Price to come. So that's the reason why he got the phone call. And it was the reason why, after he'd sort of given it the green light, she was after Price.
Well, he won. She must have that's it. When he gave it his blessing, for lack of a better word, as far as Oh, that's incredible. That's That's
that's why
incredible.
it was only a one-off. That's why it was only a one-off séance, you see, and why they kept fobbing him off then afterwards about him wanting to go back. You
Oh
see.
no, it was like, okay, we used you. We got what we wanted from your
Yeah.
visit. We really don't
Yeah.
want you. The last thing we want is for you to come back in here.
Exactly.
And
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 about 6 months later, Mr. Mortimer had received a legacy from a relative who passed away, and received a large amount of money. I've got that; that's documented. So,
uh-huh.
and then obviously a large amount of money comes in. He's able to pay off his debts. His wife miraculously loses her mediumship, and the seances
Oh my
seances.
God. And you know what? And maybe they were waiting for that money to come in along. That's why they needed just to buy time. It was
They were. I think they were. They were biding time in order
yes.
to get that in order to bankroll get the money.
Yeah, it's like we could just buy us a few more months until this money comes in, and then that's it. And
Yeah.
oh, like you said, incredibly, I can't communicate with the spirits anymore. And Ms. X, why don't you go off to France and join the resistance? Bye.
That's right. So yeah. So what? Yeah. So yeah. It's one of those strange stories,
That
which
is, but that is such an intriguing and oh my God, and it's real.
it's real. Yeah. It's a real. Every word of it is true. It's yeah. I mean, Harry Price was this remarkable character. Really, he's still very influential today. He still inspires people. I mean, he wasn't as pure as a driven snow. I think that he did, on occasion. I mean, some people don't agree with me on this, but I do think that on occasion he did fake things, for want of a better word. At Borley Rectory, I think he may have egged on some of the things in some way. But I think that was just his own personality. He wanted
Right.
to. He was a complicated man. He was passionate about the subject, passionate about psycho research. He'd found the subject in his early 40s, and he became very enthralled by it. But he wanted to do it under his own terms, and he wanted to be the big
Yes.
man ahead. And if you sort of crossed him, he came down on you like a ton of bricks. So he was a difficult man, and a frustrating man in some ways, but at the same time, I think when he did, experience genuine things, he championed it. And I think that the Rosalie case, having sort of not redeemed him, but in the 50s, his reputation was at the absolute bottom. And
Right.
so it's nice to think that he did have this experience, but it was sort of he was a victim of himself, really. Yeah.
Well, I think that when you're in, let's say, researching, debunking it, you're never going to have to worry about your reputation suffering for it. Let's face it. Because if
Yeah.
you're always finding all these people that are fraudulent, nobody's ever going to come behind you and go, no, that's not true.
Yeah.
The problem when you deal with the supernatural, which is not an on-demand thing, is that let's say you do find a moment or an instance where it's genuine or somebody that's genuine. You can't always bank on how easily you're going to be able to reproduce that as far as once you have that taste of fame.
Mm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Definitely.
And that's, I think, where a lot of and one of the things, Paul, that I've talked about is that sometimes people get this idea, and I'm not going to say so much as researchers as in psychics or mediums, that somehow or other these people, and I'm not talking about the fraudulence, or I'm talking that they're like more enlightened or good people. And I said, you could be very, very psychic, whether it's a medium or as a psychic, sensitive, however you get it. And I say, you could be a jerk. You could be an unlikable person and still have these abilities. And unfortunately, sometimes we're always hoping that somebody that is able to connect with the spirit world is nice or wouldn't pull one over on somebody else. And I think that, during those years, like Houdini and all these people that were out there debunking mediums, I think that there were some that were genuine, but they just could not. You can't produce that over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the
On a
whole thing of
consistent
the
basis.
mixed mediumship, isn't it? The fact
Right,
that
and
they.
then sometimes they would fall back on maybe doing stuff that wasn't genuine just because
Yeah.
now they were a victim of their own fame.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that's very true. I mean, there's mediums over here. I mean, Helen Duncan is a famous medium. She was famously went on trial in 1944 in the witchcraft trial over here, and was sentenced to 9 months in prison.
Wow.
And she's another man called Jack Webber. I think that they did have some sort of genuine ability, but they were under incredible pressure.
Yes.
to produce every time, and so I think that they did have to fall back on fakery now and again, to keep it.
And some of them at some point, I mean, they were making a living from it, where they would have these seances, and the more popular you became, you had more famous people coming to witness it. Mm-hmm. So talk about pressure to produce.
Yeah.
And I think that genuine mediums sometimes got exposed supposedly, but it's not that they were totally fake. I think it's just that they knew it, and it's exhausting work as far as if you're actually doing that work. So, but yeah, I think that around that time, and then you have the ones that I say these are also the genuine mediums that know better, just kept quiet because they didn't want to get somebody to go in there and try to prove that they were fake. So they just kept a very low profile.
Yeah, I think that's the way it is today. I think
exposing themselves to that type of criticism.
Yeah, I think a lot of mediumship, certainly in this country, a lot of physical mediums. I mean, there was a sort of resurgence of it in the 1990s, but I think a lot of it has gone underground. I think there is a sort of a feeling that amongst spiritualists that they don't have anything to prove anymore to the psychical researchers. So it's gone, it's gone underground. So I think there are things, that.
Well, and it's also, I hate to say it, but it's become so sensationalized.
Yeah.
Something like, fireworks. It's people now. They want to see something more evident, more dramatic, more whatever. And it's the spirit world kind of doesn't work exactly that way. Sometimes it can be very subtle, and hard to describe. And nowadays, as you know, they've got all these equipments and all these things to capture evidence. And let me ask you, when you've been doing all these different books in the paranormal, and it sounds like you absolutely do the legwork on your research, have you ever had anything happening to you at home when you're working on a certain book?
No, I can't say as I have. No, I don't. I don't think I've ever sort of created anything, or nothing happened like that. No, I mean I've got the original courtyard bell from Borley Rectory hanging on the back of my house.
You do? Oh my God! How did you get that?
That was a gift from Peter Underwood. He passed that on to me. So, and this is the big. I mean, it's a big bell. It's a big thing, and that's supposed to have rung by itself, on several occasions at Borley Rectory, but it hasn't done in my house. So, but no, I don't know. I can't say as I've had anything's happened to me in that respect. I mean, I was a member of a home circle for a couple of years. About when did I start that? That was about 2007, and with a small group of people, just sitting once a week, trying to develop phenomena. And we had some interesting things there. The medium used to go into trance and and speak in an altered state, with different personalities, and there were some interesting physical effects in the room as well. The room temperature would drop.
Okay.
And there was breezes in the room, and I'm convinced that nobody in the room was faking it. And there were knocks as well, knocks underneath my chair and things like that. So that was quite interesting, But no, I've not had anything happen to me while I've been working on a book, thankfully.
Let me ask you: what experience have you ever had? Whether you were looking for it, when I say looking for it, being in a paranormal setting, or not looking for it, but sometimes that does happen.
Well, I had I had one odd thing happen to me, and I tell the story. I've told the story a lot, and I don't know whether people believe me or not. I don't know, but every word of this is true. I think it's one of those things. I think it may be a huge coincidence thing, but I'll tell you the story.
Yes.
This goes back to when I was at school. And I was probably aged about 15 when this took place, and we used to mess around with a Ouija board, at lunch times, as people do, now and again. And we had this thing going in a little room, off of one of the art rooms. And we were supposedly, it was the typical, glass with the circle of letters, that sort of thing, And we were supposedly in touch with an aircraft pilot who was shot down over North Africa in his Spitfire in the war, Okay. And he gave a name, which subsequently I've researched, and the name is. There was nobody of that name and under that thing, but this we were supposedly in touch with this communicator, and after it had finished, the bell went, and we packed up, and we went off, and we had a games lesson. We had a rugby lesson on the school playing field, so we go out, and I hated rugby. So I sort of tried to keep away from where the action was, So I'm standing around doing nothing, and there's another lad called Robert Turner, his name was, and he was standing about 100 yards away from me, and I was standing there, and all of a sudden I heard this airplane engine noise, and I looked up, and a Spitfire plane flew over the pitch, over the football pitch, rugby pitch, and it passed. Didn't disappear, but it went out of sight behind some flats on the other side of a railway line. And I stood there and I thought, I don't believe I've seen that. That's just stupid. And then I looked across, and Robert Turner says, "Did you see that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he was like well into the war, into like all the army stuff and air force and stuff. He said it was a Spitfire plane, and I said, "Yeah." And at that time, there were only 7 Spitfires serviceable.
I was about to say, what were the chances?
There were 7 Spitfires serviceable, one of which was bright red, because I'd seen it at an air display a year or so before. So, yeah, that was one of these. I mean, I tell the story for what it is. Every word of it is true. Whether that was something, I don't know, a coincidence or whatever, but it happened. And it was an odd thing, and it's never happened to me again,
Some of those are the best experiences, unexpected. You weren't looking. It's like,
I know, it's spontaneous things, isn't it? I think that they are some of the things that happen spontaneously to people are the.
Yes.
I'm a bit sceptical. I'm not putting people down who do investigations and things like this. I think there's a lot of genuine people who are really, really committed to getting evidence and stuff. But I find that sometimes the things that happen when you least expect them, people describe some of these cases that are things happening to them, I think they are some of the most convincing things, but it certainly happened to friends of mine. A very good friend of mine had an experience when he was a boy, when he was about 10 years old, in a house in Camberwell in South London, where there was a funny family there. They were a family, and nobody ever talked to any other about it. So people were experiencing things, but nobody was telling each other, And there was footsteps up and down the stairs, and my friend was sitting in the kitchen, coming home from school, and heard footsteps coming down the stairs, walk along a passage towards the kitchen where he was sitting at the table, and literally like something out of a film, the door creaked open and there was nobody there, and he just hightailed it out.
I bet.
He was out there sitting in the garden, and his grandmother came home, and she said, "What are you doing sitting out here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just sitting out here, And they looked at each other, and he realised that she knew that something was going on, and she realised that he'd seen something. So they were,
Exactly.
It's the spontaneous things, which I think are really, really interesting, and keep us enthralled in this subject, don't they?
Yeah, I've heard of that, especially when it's several kids and everybody grows up and they move away, and then one day the conversation comes up and then everybody talks about their experiences, like, that happened to you too? Yeah. And the parents don't say anything because they want to protect the children, and but they only come about like sometimes 10 or 20 years later that everybody actually confesses to their experiences.
Yeah. They were all hearing things. His father would it seemed like somebody was getting up and walking up and down the stairs in the house. It was a big old house, an old Georgian place, really old, but actually used as a local authority house. It was it was a council owned by the local council. But and he would go out, and all of the kids were all asleep in bed, and people were hearing things like that, So it was a strange thing. So. But I've never had anything like that happen to me, I'm afraid.
I mean, I had experiences that when they were occurring, I didn't think they were. Then later on, when I thought about it, as a matter of fact, when I got older, I said, you know what? That was that.
Yeah.
But when you're a teenager, sometimes you're thinking about everything but supernatural or paranormal or anything like that. You're wanting to talk to your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your friends, or you're caught up in different things. Let me add something, Paul, that the book now, the fiction one, The Architecture of Evil.
That's on the back burner, that one is.
It is, okay. And I know sometimes fiction is more difficult in the sense to write.
You're telling me. I find, I've always been interested in writing since about the age of about 11. When finally, a couple of coincidences in my life. I've two people who were very influential to me in terms of writing, Peter Underwood and a British horror writer called Guy Smith. And funnily enough, in later life, they were very good friends of mine. I've sort of got to know them, the sort of horror, the sort of fiction. I've always wanted to write fiction, but I find it so difficult. I find it a real whereas non-fiction, I find you research, you bring facts together, and you try
and it's more like the description of events versus dialogue. We
actually create characters and make them real and make them interesting. I find it thing. So I've hopefully I will get back on with that at some point. But I'm doing the sort of, I've got loads of irons in the fire as usual. I'm doing the biography of Peter Underwood, and I'm interested in doing a book on. I love the mediums. I love the Victorian mediums. So on Florence Cook, who was a famous Victorian medium from the 1870s over here. She was famously investigated by William Crookes, the scientist. So I'm interested in doing a biography of her. So that's one of those books as well.
And what is that about the Western music?
Oh yes, that was.
Oh my God, what is that? That sounds so interesting.
I'm just interested in. I love music. I wish I could play better than I do, but I just wanted to sort of do a collection. I did a book called Written in Blood, which was about vampires in British culture. That came out about 3 years ago, and that was all like films, stories, supposedly real life, encounters and things like that. And I wanted to do a similar thing with music as well, because I love music. I love some of the classical music. You've got like Benjamin Britten's opera "Turn of the Screw" and things like that, and then you've got stories of supposedly where composers' ghosts have been seen, and things, and houses where ghostly music is heard. So really, it was to try and bring together all my interest in music, real life cases, and bring it all in one book.
That sounds so interesting. And also, what you mentioned before about Victorian times, and I mean, even though and it's like I said, when you read some of these stories. Even though they're supposed to be fiction, some of them, when you read them, they sound real. They sound like it did occur to them.
Yeah.
Like in other words, the author really did have the story retold to them, and they just made it sound, I guess, like you said, to maintain the privacy and the confidentiality of whoever it was that told them the story, especially if you didn't want to be thought of as having those types of experiences.
Yeah.
But
I find the whole Victorian era. It's just the gaslight and the idea of these seances taking place. So it was.
And even now, when you go visit a cemetery, because I've been to some cemeteries, and exactly which is the oldest part, because this is when the Victorians, they were into their their monuments in the
Yeah, yeah,
cemeteries.
definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we
I
got a
mean, it's
family.
like all the symbology and
Yeah.
the mausoleums. It's like, and then you look over and what's really plain, that's the modern ones.
Yeah, yeah, we've got some fantastic. There's some fantastic cemeteries around London. The Highgate Cemetery is the famous
Yes.
one in because there was an alleged vampire case there in the 1970s, which I wrote about in my vampire book. But that's such an amazing place to go, and you can have a guided tour around it, and it's all, as you say, the symbolism on all the tombs and fantastic, absolutely
Right. And it's
amazing.
like, and they took this seriously, in other words. And, of course, the photography of the dead people and the dead children. And
Yeah.
it's kind of morbid when you look at it from our point of view versus where they looked at it from. But it's very, very interesting how much thought they put into the afterlife or what happened to you after you
Yeah,
died.
definitely.
And then, of
Yeah,
course, even before the Victorians, then, we get into the resurrectionists and grave robbing and, God,
yeah.
so many things happen. Nowadays, a lot of people get cremated and that's it. Nothing comes of it. It's become very, how can I say, I want to say even, and sometimes I even, because I've done some, I've looked into what I call unofficial graveyards, which is where you would bury criminals, people that were on the fringes of society,
Right. Okay.
whether it was actually legally, and as an outlaw, or whether your lifestyle was, you
Mm.
know. And I said back then, people, the decent or the good people, did not want this person to be buried in the same place that they were. I mean, in other
Right.
words, after you were dead, this still had this division
Yeah.
of there should be no association. I say every time I've gone to some of these cemeteries, the paupers' graves are always in a corner, way in the back.
Okay. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and that you were lucky if you got in there.
Mm.
Um, and I said nowadays a lot of times they'll even find them when if they're digging up for a road. Well, they'll find these graveyards, and some of them are old ones, but some of them they're what they call unofficial ones because
Right.
they had to
Okay.
bury you somewhere.
Mm.
Okay, and back then there was a stigma. And I say, well, you know what? That's another thing of that sometimes you think of as hauntings. Besides the obvious that it's a forgotten graveyard, is back then you people did want to get buried in consecrated ground. There was this belief of I want somebody to pray over me, and I want to be buried the right way, even if you might have lived a desolate life.
Mm.
You were brought up. Your mindset as a child was that what happened to your body or where you were buried did affect you
Mm.
in the afterlife. So,
Yeah.
yeah, things have changed considerably since those times. But anyway, Paul, thank you so much for this
Pleasure.
time you
Thank
spent
you. Thank
here. It's
you.
been wonderful. I'm going to put a link to your website on the credits of the show. And I hope you'll come back in the future to discuss your
Thank you
other
very
works because let me tell you something. I
much.
am, that story that you said, that you talked about, that was hats off to you for your
Mm.
effort as a detective because basically that's what it took, detective work,
Yeah, it
to
is a
run it to
detective
ground.
thing. I
And
find the history of the paranormal, the very
yes,
interesting. All these things that have gone on, in the past. So it is like a detective story. So yeah,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely. And sometimes, and like you said, maybe not till now because of the resources that you're able to get to, is that actually it could be kind of narrowed down to what you found. And
yeah,
then
yeah.
the comparison of the handwriting, that's incredible. But anyway, thank you so, so much. I have
Pleasure.
enjoyed this tremendously, and I wish you the best of luck in all your future work.
Thank you very much. Very nice to spoke with you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Paul.
Bye now.
I don't know about you guys, but that was so engrossing, um, as far as what he's describing. I mean, and this is what I like. Obviously he understands. Let's say Harry Price. He kind of describes him where he has his admirable points, but he still sees where he has his fallacies as a human being with an ego and things like that. And what I like is that he took this to where it led, which was that, yes, that they had faked this. And of all the reasons, money, of course. And these people also, because of their social status, they had this reputation that they had to maintain. And I'm sure that this would have stained the family's reputation, especially back then, if any of this came out. Can you imagine? And like he said, they were connected. But, and it's also kind of sad when you think about that, they kind of took advantage of somebody that was suffering over the loss of a child, which makes a person very vulnerable. But then at the same time, this lady at some point was snapping out of it, and along came Harry Price and rescued the day. And that thing about the servant being a dwarf, I swear, I was like, you should write a book. Well, he did write a book about it, but it was like, they should make a movie out of this because this is incredible. Think about it. Think about it. Even if you leave it open-ended, okay, because, at the end, as much as they narrow it down, there's no absolutes. Even though that handwriting comparison, that's pretty good proof. Still, it's like all these things that have taken place, like he said, throughout 80 years. I'm telling you, that would make a good movie. That would make a great movie. Yeah, it's one of those things where, and I've said this before, the supernatural is not an on-demand thing. And when you have somebody, whether it's a paranormal investigator or a medium or anything like that, which is banking, and when I mean banking as in they're making money off of this, whether it's for ratings, for popularity, for money, or just to get paid, I want to say that it's inevitable that things are produced falsely, because the spirit world just does not work like that. It doesn't. It doesn't. I'm telling you, I've been doing this since the 1990s, and even before that, like I said, I've read everything I could lay my hands on since I was a kid, and it just doesn't work that way. You can't. It's not like a dog that you teach it tricks and it does it on command. So whenever you get into that position where you need for something to happen, I'm telling you right now, I guarantee you that somebody at some point is either producing something totally or maybe something subtle, because this is the thing. What people don't understand, if and I'm not talking here, and if you got genuine spirit communication in whatever form, doesn't always have to be through a medium. Sometimes the most they can produce for you is something very subtle that maybe only you or the person's interested would understand or would notice. And sometimes it takes quite an effort, which sometimes isn't even captured on a camera, or, and I'm going to give you a perfect example. Let's say all of a sudden you smell a certain perfume, and let's say your grandmother's perfume, or your aunt, cousin, whoever, your dad's cologne, well, or a certain smell in the house. How do you quantify a smell? How do you capture a smell? Besides the person saying, I smelled it. Or that you yourself, the person, understand, goes, oh my God, that's my grandma's, gardenia perfume that she always wore. Okay? And sometimes it's as subtle as that. And that's the best they can do for you, especially if you're trying to communicate with them, or they're coming by to say hello and just make sure you're okay. Which is another point that I make, that most human souls or entities, spirits, whatever you want to call them, once you've passed on and you're enlightened, when I say enlightened, you want to have as little to do with the earth plane as possible. Okay, your ego is gone. You understand where you're at. You don't need a human body or any of the things that come with people that are alive and that live on the earth plane as in food, shelter, clothing. Your ego runs the show, that possessiveness, the need for all these things. Once you reach that, you don't want to hang out. This is not your place anymore. And you have this understanding that your loved ones that are left behind, even though you might come and visit them, you kind of know this is your moment now to work it out. You have this trust that things are unfolding as they should for them, whether it's through your family or free choice or whatever they might be, just like you did or they did when they were alive. In other words, you don't want to hang out here. And whenever you have the spirits that a lot of times that you see too much of or hear too much of, if it's true, if it's not produced, then you're talking a human spirit that is in a place it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. That's why I think, especially in those cases where people are trying always to contact the soul of a child, which I imagine has got to be one of the most heartbreaking events that could happen to another human being. There's a point where you want them to be on their way and not tied to your emotions, your suffering, all the things that happen to you or your family, and just know that eventually you'll be together and that you'll not want to hang out here anyway either. But yeah, I think that, like I said, I'm not surprised when at the end, Paul, the finale was that it looks like, yes, that this was fraud, whether he overlooked it because he wanted to overlook it because the possible fame attached to it, or he was genuinely deceived because they kind of like planned this out real well. Plus they had a lot riding on. Who knows? I'm not surprised. That's what happens. That's why, unfortunately, a lot of work in the paranormal field gets a bad rap. And some of it is deserved, but a lot of it is not. So guys, thank you so much for listening and for viewing. Please catch me on Facebook and on Twitter. I live stream there. Catch the podcast or the show on Spreaker, iHeartRadio, iTunes. I always post also on Tumblr links to the shows. So of course, please, thank you so much for viewing and listening. And I also, like I said, I do a live stream on mostly on Periscope for Twitter and on Facebook. And also, again, to my true believers, please don't forget me, Marlene at MiamiGhostChronicles.com. Send me an email, video of yourself, taping yourself, and tell me your true ghost encounters, or that weird light that you saw in the sky, or if you live out somewhere in the boonies, you think Bigfoot is camping out in your backyard. I don't care. I would love to hear from you guys. Please send it to me, and I'll include it in the show. If you have a set of stories, I can get together and contact you. Maybe I could either interview you on the phone or through Skype, like I did with Paul and some of my other guests. Either way, please don't forget to send me those stories. And again, thank you so very, very much for being part of my audience. Take care.